In this video, we're going to have a look at the potential impact of the lift in interest-only loan mortgage rates on the household sector. There's been a lot said about the growth in investment loans and indeed the measures undertaken by APRA and the RBA over the past 6 months to try and slow the rapidly growing segment of the market, as it's seen to pose a significant risk to financial stability going forward. So I want to start with just having a look at some trends in the residential loan market. And what we're seeing on this chart is broken down into investment loans and owner-occupied loans. And for example, since 2012, the amount of residential loans outstanding has grown from about 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion. If we split that out into investor and owner-occupied, investor loans, the blue bars have grown from about 350 billion in 2012 to around about 535 billion. So there's been significant growth already in the residential loan market. Now, focusing in purely on the interest-only loan segment, what we can see here, the red line on this chart shows the average balance of interest-only loans, how it's grown from in 2012 around just under 300,000 for the average loan to up around about 350,000 for the average loan. Now we'll look at the growth in investor loans over the recent years and the impact of macroprudential controls that have been put in place. So on this chart on the right-hand scale, the light purple line, we're looking at the growth in interest-only mortgages, annual growth, and you can see that the growth during that sort of 2010 through to 2014 hovered around the 10 to 15% mark, spiked up in 2014-15 to as high as 20%. These are total outstanding loans. And the first round of macroprudential controls put in place, as well as some associated increases in mortgage rates around that time. You can see the move up in standard investor rates and so on. You did see a fall away in investor loan growth back to around single digit and more recently down to 5%. We've now seen another round of macroprudential controls and also a lift in interest rates. So it does seem to be did have an impact in 2015 into early 2016 and does seem to be having an impact at the present time. The darker purple line on this chart shows overall investment loans, shows a similar story with strong growth that actually slowed after the first round of measures were put in place. Now, interest-only loans, mortgage rates have actually increased in some cases by 50 points, perhaps as much as 75 basis points since the latter part of last year. And that's represented in this chart here. The blue line is an estimate of the mortgage rate. We can debate the actual levels, but what we've built in is a projection of a 75 basis point increase from the levels that existed in the latter part of 2016. So what we're interested in is the impact of this increase in interest payments or interest rates on the servicing of those loans. So that's represented by the red line below, and what that is showing is essentially the change in the interest payment. So if we build in a 75 basis point lift in interest rates on interest-only loans, it amounts to about 2,700 on the overall per annum for the average household. So that would equate to around about 2.5% of income, and that's represented here, as you can see there on the right-hand scale. So an increase in interest-only loan mortgage rates of that magnitude amounts to something like 2.5% of average household income, which is a little bit over 100,000. Given that about 18% of households have an interest-only loan, then the overall impact on total household income we estimate to be around about 0.5% or maybe 0.3% of GDP. So it is a fairly significant move and impact in terms of cash flow on the household budget. So that's a fairly sizable impact on the household cash flow position. The situation could potentially be worse if all those interest-only loans were converted over to the P&I loans, which is sort of part of the motivation for the exercise. And while it might be welcomed in terms of paying down debt over the longer term a bit faster than just only compared to interest-only loans, it would have a bigger drain on cash flow. And we estimate that if all these households, or all these interest-only loans, I should say, did convert, then the increase in the monthly repayments would amount to around about 6% of household income. And that's even allowing for a lower rate than the new higher interest-only rates. So the base case is that households take the interest-only increase in rates, has an impact of about 2.5% on income, or they switch to P&I rates, which would amount to around 5 to 6% of income. If we estimate that half of the move, we get something like 3.5% of income in terms of the hit to cash flow, and allowing for the fact that just under 20% of all households have interest-only loans, then the overall impact on household income cash flow is a detraction of around about 0.7% or thereabouts, which would have a meaningful impact on GDP. And so in terms of relating this back to spending then, in this chart we're looking at the interest-only expense. The blue line is the interest-only expense as a proportion of household income, 12-month change in that number. So an increase of 75 basis points, which is copped entirely by interest-only loans, has an impact of around about 2.5%. That's inverted on the right-hand scale. And the red line here is retail trade 12-month change. And so we already know that we had a shock downturn in the July and August retail trade numbers, with the annual rate falling to 2.1%. And what this is suggesting is that the interest rate hit, or the cash flow hit, that reflects the increase in interest-only loans, would have an ongoing impact on retail sales going forward.